I am Jill McKee. I'm a pediatric epileptologist at CHOP, and I'm excited to be kicking off this next few talks that are going to be a little more data heavy. I'm going to start with a broad overview of natural history and different ways that we can use retrospective data to really try to get a handle on natural history of different genetic epilepsies and then epilepsy more broadly. Those are some disclosures. So brief outline of what I want to share with you guys today. First, want to give a brief overview of natural history and like why do we care? Why is this important? And then going to focus on two different ways we can use retrospective electronic medical record data to really understand natural history. First is using structured reporting within the electronic medical record, and the second is using all the other stuff in there, all the unstructured data, and how can we leverage computational methods to really understand what it tells us about epilepsy. So first, why does natural history matter? I think I'm preaching to the choir here, but there's many reasons that this is really important information to have. First is for prognosis, give families an idea of what to expect in the future. Improving care, if you know what to expect in the natural history of a disorder, you can be proactive rather than reactive. And then becoming increasingly more critical is clinical trial readiness. There are many exciting therapies under development for many different forms of epilepsy, but to really assess if they're effective, you need to understand the natural history to know if a therapy is actually making a difference. So when I think of clinical trial readiness, I kind of think of two broad components, natural history and then biomarkers. And today I'm really just going to focus on natural history. So in order to understand natural history of rare disorders, the gold standard is really like a prospective, formal natural history study. But you can also get at this using retrospective real-world data, which is what I'm going to focus on today. And the goals are to identify outcomes that are measurable, capture the full spectrum of a disorder, and then are meaningful. We really want something that's meaningful for families, and then also expected to improve with treatment. So when we're talking about natural history, we're really talking about phenotypes. How do we capture clinical features over time? And there's several different approaches to this, and these range from very large-scale phenotyping efforts where you can recruit a huge cohort of patients, but only really get very superficial data. And then range all the way down to very, very detailed natural history studies where you can gather very, very detailed, rich data, standardized outcome measures, but only in a relatively small cohort of individuals just because it's not feasible to do more. So there's always this trade-off between sample size that you can study and the granularity of the data you're able to get. So focusing specifically on natural history, there's two main approaches, which I mentioned previously. Prospective natural history studies, which are the gold standard, include standardized clinical assessments, assess the appropriateness of specific outcome measures for future clinical trials, but these can be very expensive and time-consuming. And then there's retrospective real-world data, leveraging data that's gathered through routine clinical care. This can sometimes be plagued by missing data that's recorded at different scales or levels of detail, but it's relatively fast because we're using data we already have. So focusing on this for the rest of the talk, and going to be kind of breaking this into two main components, using structured reporting and then more free text, unstructured reporting, and how do we handle that? How do we wrangle that with different computational methods? So first, focusing on structured reporting. Zach Grinspan is speaking right after me, so I don't want to steal any of his thunder because he's really pioneered many of these efforts in pediatric epilepsy. But I'm briefly going to touch on how we can use structured reporting in a learning health system framework to improve care and data collection. So what is a learning health system? This is an approach to care delivery with continuous improvement, clinical outcomes. You have cycles of data aggregation, analysis, reporting, and then hopefully causing changes in clinical practice and then starting the cycle all over again. And this is a great approach for quality improvement studies, but it also facilitates standardized data collection that we can then leverage for other research questions. So at CHOP, we've implemented a standardized structured reporting template, which is this form you see here on the screen. It's built into our EHR that documents epilepsy clinical histories. The neurologist just goes through and clicks different buttons, and then the data is aggregated and it's stored in common data elements in the electronic medical record database, can be easily extracted. And then it also populates your note template, so it can kind of save time. So we're incorporating this into clinical care. It includes important information that the care team would like to know about the child's epilepsy, but then stores this data in a way that can be easily pulled for research and quality improvement efforts. So here's one example of how we're able to use this data. This study analyzed seizure severities in over 1,000 individuals across the 6 most common epilepsy syndromes using age-stamped standardized seizure scores using a scale that was developed by the Pediatric Epilepsy Learning Health System. And I've highlighted that LGS group here, illustrating the relatively high seizure frequency across the lifespan, which is something that's not going to be surprising to any of you in the audience today. Another way we've implemented standardized reporting templates is for EEG reports. So here is a screenshot of what epileptologists see when filling out an EEG report. And again, all these click buttons store data to specific common data elements in the EHR that can be easily pulled and analyzed. So first and foremost, this creates a clinical EEG report, which I'm showing you an example of here. But then we can also extract this data for research. So here I'm just showing the volume of our EEGs reported using this common data element form over time, and this is actually very out of date. This is only up to 2022, and we're now up to around 100,000 EEGs reported using this template. So I'm excited about the research potential of these. We've actually showed, too, that this can improve the quality of clinical care reported, because what I'm showing you here on the right is the overall completion of these EEG reports, like which actual features did people comment on. And using this form actually forced people to comment on all the things they're supposed to comment on when they're reading an EEG. So that was another side hidden benefit of this. And then we can actually use this data to use build machine learning algorithms to try to predict which patients would go on to develop seizures. And this was done in a neonatal population in our NICU, but can easily be expanded to other groups. And since these models were built using common data elements, we can actually embed these prediction models into the electronic medical record, so you can facilitate real-time clinical decision support. So this is really a way that we could close the loop on a learning health system approach to care. So as with all methods for gathering natural history study data, there are pros and cons. So some of the pros of a structured reporting system are it standardizes your collection of data, allows for data entry to occur within existing clinical workflows. You can disseminate the tools across different institutions to standardize data collection across sites. And once they're built and used, the data collection is actually pretty passive and easy. And it can be leveraged for clinical decision support. There are drawbacks, though. This requires a lot of upfront work to develop these tools. They can be somewhat inflexible and difficult to modify once they're built. And then there's a limited amount of things you can do with this, right? Like we can't have people template every possible thing you might be interested in. And then also data collection is dependent on clinician uptake. If people won't fill out the form, you don't get any data. So what else can you do? So I showed you how we can use structured reporting, but what about all the other data? Most of the data stored in our electronic health records is completely unstructured. Free text and office notes, telephone encounters, and this is a lot of data. So here I'm just showing you over 1 million neurology notes in over 100,000 patients arranged by age, and this represents over 120,000 patient years of data. But how do we make sense of it? So one approach, and the one that I commonly use in my research, is using the human phenotype ontology, which is a hierarchical dictionary of clinical terms that allows you to compare clinical features across patients, even when they're recorded at different levels of detail. So in my work, I've primarily used this to understand the natural history of rare genetic epilepsies. So I'm going to give you an example using SYNGAP1 related disorders. So SYNGAP is among the most common genetic and developmental epileptic encephalopathies, characterized by developmental delay, autism, intellectual disability, and generalized epilepsy. And it's actually one of the few monogenic causes of generalized epilepsy. So I showed you this slide earlier, but now I'm just going to put it into some context. Especially in rare disease, it's really critical that we use all available data. So in SYNGAP, we've leveraged data across 3 different levels of scale and granularity. So we integrated data from insurance claims from a company called Ambit, representing a very large cohort, but low granularity. Then we use the Citizen Health data set, which is a company that aggregates electronic medical record data. And they have pretty decent but moderate sample sizes and somewhat moderate granularity. And then finally, we looked at our local cohort of patients that we follow, where we have very, very detailed data on, but much smaller population size. So then we harmonized this data to help us understand the natural history of SYNGAP. So by combining these data sources, we can reconstruct epilepsy histories and determine the cumulative seizure onset and the predominant seizure types. We can also assign seizure severity scores in monthly time bins that can help facilitate comparisons to other genetic epilepsies, as I'm showing here. And from these analyses, we see that in SYNGAP, seizures are more commonly generalized and tend to occur later on than in other monogenic epilepsies. We can also pull medication prescription data from the electronic medical records. And just to give you a sense of the treatment landscape here, so for seizures, we see frequent use of Keppra, Depakote, and Omphy, followed by lamotrigine when kids get a little bit older. And behavior is a really prominent concern in SYNGAP as well, so we also made a medication landscape of behavioral meds. And you can see a lot of meds for sleep early on, and then antipsychotics later, as well as other medications for behavioral indications. So since we can pull the seizure frequencies, and then we can pull the medication prescription data, we can combine these 2 data sources to come up with a comparative effectiveness analysis to try to get a sense of which of these seizure medications are working best. And this here shows the relative efficacy of Depakote and Lamictal for seizures in SYNGAP. Using insurance claims data, we have the benefit of comparing clinical features in a specific subcohort of patients to other broader populations. So here I'm comparing the frequency of clinical symptoms in SYNGAP to a broader cohort, and this is like 700,000 patients with what we call like a G40 plus diagnosis, which is just a broad epilepsy cohort, to try to highlight like the clinical signature of SYNGAP. And we can also do this comparing it to other groups. So here I'm comparing to 3,600 individuals with Angelman on the top, and then 5,400 individuals with Rett syndrome on the bottom. And what remains true is that behavioral concerns and autism are like very, very common problems in SYNGAP. So what I just showed you was just a snapshot in time, which doesn't really tell you much about the actual natural history of the disorder. But we can also look at timestamp data using insurance claims and see that those with SYNGAP, these clinical features tend to emerge from the broader comparator groups around the 2nd year of life. Electronic health record data can also be used to assess developmental milestone acquisition. So as you can see here, the range of developmental milestones achieved in SYNGAP ranges from like 20-ish% in the ability to use verbal communication, all the way up to more than 95% in good fine motor skills and nonverbal communication. So what next? As you can probably tell, this detailed phenotyping takes a lot of work. It can be very effective, but it's not really tractable for very, very large populations of patients. Manual longitudinal phenotyping is very, very resource intensive. We're manually going through these records sometimes and assigning these HPO terms. And then structured reporting has limited flexibility, scope, and provider uptake. So what I'm hoping to do next is we're starting to look at leveraging other AI techniques to extract time-stamped seizure type data, seizure frequency data, and other standardized phenotypes from the EHR. This will allow us this will be a scalable technique that we can have a much broader deployment across different epilepsies. So I hope I've given you a sense about why we should care about natural history, and then 2 ways that we can use retrospective EMR data to really try to reconstruct the natural history of disorders using data we already have. So yeah, happy to take any questions.
If you present in 5 to 10 years a similar presentation, will the EMR data be much more common and interoperable and easier analysis, or is just the nature of the beast, it's always going to be kind of a mess?
I'm curious to hear what Zach will say about this too, but we need to agree on what we think is important and how we're recording things. So I think in 10 years it may still be a bit of a mess. I think we will have better AI tools to sort through the mess. So I think we will be able to glean more from the data, but I don't know that we will all get on the same page in recording things in the same way.
What is the one thing that we, the provider seeing the patient, can do to make the work you do, this research, easier?
I mean, we can deploy these tools to other sites, so we would love to have more sites use anyone who has Epic using these smart forms for data collection, because then we can share data across sites and get a much broader cohort.